Money. If you're anything like me, you probably have way too much of it. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, for most of human history, money didn't even exist. And when it did, it was often in the form of weird things like seashells and salt. So how did we end up with this stuff? Well, that's what I'll explain right now. Okay, before I get started, I just want to say that this is not financial advice. Okay, now let's begin. In order to understand where we are today, it helps to know where we came from. The earliest forms of currency were commodities, or goods that could be used as money because they had value outside of being money. For example, some societies used livestock as their form of currency. This worked pretty well since cows were useful for many things, including food, labor, and, sacrifice to gods. However, as a society grows, it's not practical to use bigger animals as money. So smaller, more portable animals like chickens eventually became preferred. One of the biggest problems with using livestock as money is that, well, they're kinda dumb. It's hard to keep track of how many you own without constantly counting them. Also, what if you wanted to buy something that cost, say, 3 cows but you only had 2? You would have to find someone else who also had 3 cows and wanted to make the same purchase. Basically, it was difficult to find sellers who would accept your offer, unless you happened to have the exact number of chickens needed. Over time, people began using other items that were easier to count and carry around, such as beads and shells. For example, cowrie shells were used as currency in China as far back as 1000 BC. Each shell represented 1 cowrie, which was equivalent to about 2 chickens at the time. But over time, the Chinese began trading with other countries and soon realized that they needed a more universally valuable commodity. Around 600 BCE, the Chinese found it in a metal that was both rare and useful: bronze. At first, bronze was exchanged for its value as a metal, not as money. That changed when it became too expensive to weigh out the amount of bronze needed for transactions. Instead, the Chinese began exchanging long rods of bronze that were stamped with symbols signifying their value. They became known as cowrie rods because they replaced the cowrie shell currency. One rod was worth 100 cows and each end was stamped with the symbol for 10. So the whole thing was worth 100. Eventually, these rods were cut into smaller pieces, basically coins, which made transactions even easier. Now, there's no way I could cover every type of ancient currency, so I'm just going to highlight a few interesting ones. The Lydians were a kingdom in what is today Turkey, who invented the first true coinage in 600 BCE. Their coins were stamped with the image of a lion, hence the name. These coins were the first to have a set value determined by the government. Instead of being based on the value of materials, this innovation made trade easier throughout their empire. But the Lydians also exported their coinage, meaning the coins were accepted outside of Lydia. The Lydian currency system was so successful that it inspired Alexander the Great to adopt similar coins throughout his empire. However, for many parts of the world, it took centuries for coins to catch on. The Austronesian peoples of Taiwan and the Philippines used rice as a form of currency as early as 300 CE. Rice was a staple of their diet, and it was easy to store and transport in woven bamboo, so it made sense to use as money. In fact, many other cultures around the world used agricultural products as money. Potatoes were used in the Andes, grain in Mesopotamia, cotton in India, and tobacco in North America. Fast forward to the 14th century and the Chinese were already using paper money. It was an ingenious invention by 2 merchants named Liu Jie and Cai Jing. They issued a sort of check for a certain amount of money to customers who would then redeem them for silver. Soon, other merchants followed suit, and checks began circulating outside of the marketplaces. This was actually the first recorded use of paper currency, although the invention isn't quite what we think of today. In Europe, it would take until the 17th century before paper currency caught on. The first European banknote was issued in Sweden in 1661 by a merchant and private moneylender named Johannes Hufnagel. Hufnagel issued notes promising payment of a certain value to anyone who presented them to him. It was essentially a check drawn by a private party, but the innovation wouldn't last. Hufnagel was eventually imprisoned for counterfeiting his own notes, though it wasn't entirely his fault. See, there was no real regulation of private currencies. Anyone could start issuing their own money, which led to all sorts of counterfeiting and confusion. It wasn't until the 20th century that a new technology emerged: credit cards. But before I tell you about them, I need to explain the fundamental economic principle that underpins the entire concept of money. There are 3 main functions of money. First, money needs to be a medium of exchange, something easily used to buy goods and services. Second, it needs to be a unit of account, something consistent to measure the value of goods. And third, it needs to be a store of value, meaning it can be saved and used for a transaction later. In other words, you can't just use anything as money. It has to meet certain criteria. It must be easily divided, durable, recognizable, and most importantly, have a stable value. If the value of your currency fluctuates too much, it becomes impossible to use as a unit of account. And while these criteria may seem obvious, it explains why so many alternative currencies failed. Take, for example, cigarettes. During World War II, US soldiers used packs of cigarettes as a form of currency in some areas they occupied. However, it failed when soldiers moved on to other places and the cigarettes couldn't be used as a medium of exchange. Cigarettes were also very perishable. Soldiers would frequently smoke them, rendering them worthless. There was also no central authority regulating the packs, meaning counterfeit cigarettes became widespread. Cigarettes also did not hold value outside of war-torn areas. In other words, they did not function as a unit of account outside of those places. And that brings us back to credit cards. Credit cards are unique in that they aren't a physical object, but rather a method of payment. In that way, they resemble checks, but instead of going to a bank, you hand the card to a machine. Credit cards were first introduced in the 1920s in the form of hotel room keys. Customers would turn them in at the front desk when they checked out, but it wasn't until after World War II that credit cards were used for retail purchases. The first credit card, the Diners Club card, was introduced in 1950, but it wasn't until the 1980s that they really took off. The reason is simple. Banks trusted that people would pay back the money they borrowed to make purchases. In other words, credit cards allowed people to spend more money than they had, making them an ideal form of currency. However, another problem arose. People spent way too much money. When you can buy things without paying for them immediately, it's easy to overspend. And that's when debit cards were invented. Unlike credit cards, debit cards require you to have enough money in your account to make a purchase. Of course, this doesn't stop people from spending more money than they have, but it does stop them from going into debt. But then along came Bitcoin. In 2008, a white paper was circulated describing a new digital currency that would change the world forever. It was called Bitcoin, and it was the first cryptocurrency, meaning it was a digital currency that used cryptography to regulate the transfer of funds. The idea was proposed by an unknown person or group under the alias Satoshi Nakamoto. Nakamoto described a decentralized system, meaning there was no central bank or authority. Instead, a network of computers kept track of all transactions, verifying and recording them on a public ledger. That system is called the blockchain. I am not going to try to explain exactly how it works, because I don't think I fully understand it myself. But imagine having a spreadsheet, except instead of storing personal information like your name and address, it stores monetary information like how much money you have and how much you owe. That spreadsheet is the blockchain. And once a record is added, it cannot be removed. Therefore, the entire network must agree on the validity of any changes. Bitcoins are earned by a process called mining. Miners use their computers to complete complex math equations. As they solve the equation, they verify batches of transactions, adding them to the blockchain and receive Bitcoin as payment. Now, the value of Bitcoin has skyrocketed since its introduction. In 2010, a single Bitcoin was worth about 8 cents. Today, it's worth over $60,000. Of course, the value fluctuates wildly. At one point in 2017, a single Bitcoin was worth almost $20,000. Then again, at the beginning of 2020, it was worth less than $10,000. Not everyone is on board with cryptocurrencies though. Many governments have expressed concerns about the lack of regulation, leading some to ban it altogether. Others worry that they're too volatile to serve as a unit of account. So only time will tell whether cryptocurrencies will stand the test of time. As for me, I still prefer cold, hard cash. Not because I don't believe in cryptocurrencies, but because I'm pretty sure this is what passes as money in heaven. Thank you for watching.